Okay, gang, this screencast is going to focus primarily on tiered instruction with a brief introduction to anchor activities. As the cartoon here suggests, these are some differentiation strategies, and I chose to include tiered instruction in our course here after seeing the results from the pre-assessment and recognizing that maybe all of us weren't 100% confident on exactly what the process is. So just to recall, there's lots of different ways to differentiate our instruction. Like I said, we're going to focus on tiered instruction, but we're going to start with a short definition introduction to anchor activities, but you're going to actually practice designing a tiered lesson plan. Okay, primarily this is important because some of us seem to have confused anchor activities with something else in ed lingo known as sponge activities. All you need to know is anchor activity is not a sponge. They are not supposed to be designed as something to quote unquote suck up time when somebody finishes fast and somebody else is taking longer on a task among your students. So anchor activities should be things that are ongoing, kids can work on themselves, and something that relates to the broader learning goals of whatever the unit is that you're teaching. We need them, we do need them because people are finishing at different rates, but we also need them so that we can meet with students individually or in small groups, and this is how an anchor activity can support differentiation. So again, these kinds of activities should be meaningful, ongoing, kids can work on them on their own, and the primary purpose of an anchor activity, which is different than a quote-unquote sponge, is that it's supposed to give you time to pull out smaller groups of students to work with them individually, whatever form that might need to take. So here's primarily a structure for thinking about using anchor activities. Obviously, the first thing we need to do is make sure we have clear directions so they can work independently. But it's something that we typically might see at the elementary level, where a teacher is working with a small pull-out group. But actually, this differentiation approach can be very powerful in both the middle grades and a secondary classroom once we teach our students how to be a little more self-directed. But like I said, we're primarily focused on tiered instruction. I don't know why I included that tiered wedding cake. I don't know why. I just thought it looked kind of pretty. But what is tiering? It's a way to adjust learning tasks so that they are better aligned with students' readiness levels, their abilities, and their needs. So in the past, when we've talked about a lot of our discussion, I should say, about differentiation, there's been focus on student interest or quote unquote learning styles and learning preference. We haven't necessarily really specifically focused on how do you adjust tasks, assignment, learning activities so that they're better aligned with the wide range of readiness levels or abilities in your classroom. So when you're tiering, oops, went too fast, didn't I? It's about adjusting an activity or a task or an assignment or whatever so that it's better aligned with your kids' ability levels. So there, as you can see here, there's lots of different things that can be quote unquote adjusted with any learning task so that it's better aligned with your students' needs and abilities. So what you want to do when you're designing a tiered, lesson is first, of course, like with any lesson, you got to identify, right, what you want them to know, be able to do. It's super important to pre-assess because this way you'll know which group kids need which type of task. And even though down at the bottom there you see where it says group 1 task, group 2 task, group 3 task, tiered learning activities do not need to be cooperative learning tasks. I just use the word group in terms of figuring out which kids belong in which group that they would get the appropriate task. It might be something that they work on independently and individually. But it could be something where you have them work on with a partner. And you would start with a whole class experience that would sort of frame for kids what the lesson is about and make sure that everybody understands the primary learning goals. So you're going to practice creating a tiered lesson plan using the quote-unquote football model. So you can see here your introductory set. Everybody's together doing the same thing, introducing the learning goals and getting them, interested and hooked. It's the developmental activities that will be tiered. I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And then your concluding activities should be something that brings all the students back together so you can make sure that all of them have learned the fundamentals, the basics, but also so they can share what they've learned with their classmates. There's lots of different ways to tier. And one of the important things we need to do before we get started is to think about what needs to be tiered. And that depends on the learning goals and the developmental activity itself. So what you're going to do is pick one of your lesson plans, and I'm going to ask you to think about these questions and use them to help you figure out how to tier the instruction. So maybe, there might be points where, Rapid Robin gets done real quick and Slow Stan needs more time. That means you're going to want to tier the learning activity by challenge or level of complexity so that Rapid Robin is still working at the same while Slow Stan is working. So they're all finishing around the same time, but they might be doing different things. You might want to look at your lesson plan, look at that learning activity, and it may be that you need to tier by the resources, the curriculum materials that are being used. And that most obvious is like, think about reading levels as a way to differentiate resources for students within the same developmental activity. Another way to tier is thinking about how the outcomes might be different for each student, even though they're using the same materials. So that's tiering by outcome, and you'll see some more about that in the resources I posted in Folio. You may think that they all could be using the same resource, they could be working toward the same outcome, but maybe the actual process through which they do the learning needs to be different for different students with different strengths and different ability levels. And then finally, it might be that the students are using the same resource, they're doing the same sort of process, but based on their particular strengths, weaknesses, the lesson may need to be tiered by product. So just to recap, tiered lessons, everybody's working on the same concept or skill. There's a whole class introductory activity, right, that gets everybody started, focuses, that you can differentiate or tier based on lots of different characteristics, but that all of the activities should be what Carol Tomlinson calls respectful tasks. In other words, the lower tiers, if you will, should not be busy work, and those students that are more advanced do not necessarily need to get just more work. So what you're going to do is use your formative assessment data that you just analyzed to create 3 different tiers of students based on needs and readiness. So what does that mean? So you're going to take out those evaluation criteria that you created for the last task, right? And look across your data and try to move students into 3 separate groups. Like maybe you have a group that, I'm going to use my example, that couldn't write a clear argument, couldn't use evidence, and their evidence they used was inaccurate. They're going to be group 1. My group 2 had a clear argument. They were kind of squishy on the evidence and a little squishy on the accuracy of their facts they used, so they're going to be group 2. So any student that sort of had those, was in that zone, goes into group 2. And then group 3, those are my folks that clear argument, used evidence, knew what they were talking about. Those are the folks that are ready to move on to the next thing. So what I want you to do is use your formative assessment data, thinking about your criteria, and create 3 separate groups, if you will, of students. You don't have to put actual students in them, right? But I want you to think about, we're trying to practice how we can create different learning activities. So one way to think about it, right, is when you're thinking about tier 1, this might be one way to think about it. So those students that might need something, a reading that's a little less difficult, that might need fewer steps in any process that they're doing, that might need more direct comprehension or knowledge questions. You get the idea. And you can go back and read this too to help you later. But this is what you're going to be using this to guide the creation of 3 different learning activities that are aligned with the different tiers. So again, we're using this football model. This is what you're going to be submitting, a lesson plan to me. And so the lesson plan should have an introductory set where everybody's doing the same thing. I should see 3 tiers of developmental activities here, 3 tiers. And a concluding activity where in some way or how we're going to confirm that they've all learned hit the learning objective and that they can share what they've learned. So one way to think about approaching this, it's just a suggestion, is to start with, when you get to writing the tiered assignments, you write the task, whatever it might be. Like maybe it might be, they're going to read across 2 primary sources and historical photographs and try to figure out why the Great Migration happened. I don't know. Anyway, that's the idea. So I would design this right here. Then I want to ask myself, okay, what in this task needs to be changed in terms of the steps, the reading assignments, the questions posed, so that it's better aligned with the learning abilities of kids in that first tier. So I might need to change the reading. I might need to modify the readings. I might need to have more questions that help them walk through what they're reading. You get the idea. After I'm done with that, I'm going to come back to my task and ask myself, all right, what would I need to do so that the students who already are pretty confident in those skills can be challenged, so that they are also still learning something and not doing busy work or extra work. So it's the same objectives, the same amount of time, not more or less work for any student, just adjusted in terms of difficulty level. So here's a review of what you'll be doing. Okay, you're going to go into that lesson, like I said, and try to figure out, should I tier it by complexity, outcome? You get the idea. One tool to help you with this is something that's called the equalizer. Carol Thomason created this as a way to help teachers adjust the difficulty of a task. And I know this seems perhaps abstract, but I have loaded into Folio 2 different resources to help explain the equalizer. But for example, if you were thinking about, let's just say, my student that was at the foundational level, they really have like no background knowledge, whereas a kid that might be over here really already knows how to apply the concepts and principles about things and has mastered the basic material and is ready to do something with that material. So when you're adjusting the task, right, you got to think about kids that have little background knowledge and those that already get it and are ready to move on. And each of these has descriptions to help you think about how you might do that. So we're adjusting the task using the equalizer. We're creating 3 different tiers. So that's just a recap of the directions again. I'm pretty sure they're up in the assignment task in Folio. And I have loaded into the differentiating with data folder. You'll see 2, like I said, 2 explanations of the equalizer. And there is also a hyperlink to a Learn board I created with more resources on differentiation. Now that Learn board has resources that are not just aligned with tiered instruction. So I want to make sure that you look at the tiered instruction websites, because you will find examples of tiered lesson plans in language arts, math, and science. And no, there is no social studies. Nobody is doing it. What? I know, it's very frustrating. This tiered lesson will be due on Friday, May 29th at 5 p.m. It is a draft. I will be giving you copious feedback, and then you will be submitting a final. You will receive a 100% on the draft if it's submitted by the deadline. You don't submit by the deadline, you don't get full credit. You will also find in Folio uploaded the tiered lesson plan checklist. I want you to use this as you are creating your tiered lesson plan to help you remember what needs to be included. And I'm also going to use this to evaluate your work, and you are going to use it to self-assess a little bit later. But for now, think about getting ready to submit that draft on Friday at May 29th at 5 p.m. Thank you.